my name's Nikki Kemp. I'm the trends editor at Campaign Magazine, and I've got a brilliant panel here to discuss the effect of the side hustle, better work or compromise work. The side hustle is currently one of the most overused terms in marketing, which is quite hard because we love a buzzword. So is the side hustle and hustle culture more generally masking the fact that for some, the side hustle is an economic necessity or a hedge against feeling like a creative failure? I've got a brilliant panel here to discuss this issue. I'm going to kick off with asking them all to introduce themselves and explain their side hustle. I'm going to start with Ben at the end because he has a slightly unusual side hustle in that his side hustle is slagging off side hustles. He wrote an article for Campaign recently, which is very good. I will tweet it later, about how side hustles are a distraction and why side hustles suck. And he's now on a panel about side hustles. So if I could start with you, Ben, that would be great.
Is that working? Is that working? Hi, I'm Ben, CCO and co-founder of Creature, and I'm the bad one that hates side hustles.
I'm Lauren. My day job is I'm the head of marketing for Wildfire, which is a social content agency, and my night job or side hustle is I'm the founder of something called Powersuit Social, which is I call it a creative network, but that's a sort of grandiose way of calling it. It's a series of events about the future of the creative industries and a podcast about how we stay employable in unpredictable times.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Roundtree, and again, I'll do the same thing. My day job is that I'm a freelance creative director currently at RGA, and as a side hustle, I do my own podcast as well called This Way Up, all about sort of capturing women leaders in the creative industry and looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly of their career, especially the ugly, because I find that that's where you learn the most.
Thank you. And so the term side hustle is kind of a relatively new term, but in the creative industries, a lot of us have been moonlighting, you know, that's just been part of the job from the beginning. Do you think that there has been a rise in having a side project? What do you think, Rebecca?
Yeah, I don't think there is. I think people are less shy about talking about their side hustle. They feel like, I think we've always had sort of people with different hobbies and different sort of things that they love. And I think just people just are more open about it.
Yeah. And what's your view, Lauren?
It feels as though there are more of them, to me, more people with side hustles, but I think it's also to do with people making time to brand them, that like there's a sort of democratization of tech and social media that means that anybody can start their own brand and you can make it seem a lot bigger than it is. So actually the projects were probably a similar scale or similar types of things as those as they've ever been, but you can kind of have a shop window which would make it seem as though it's a much bigger thing than it is.
I suppose the Instagram effect of things that we've always done, but now we're kind of talking about them. And Ben, what's your view from a Creature perspective? I mean, are you kind of drowning in staff like creating their own gin brands? Is that what kind of drove you to write your piece about why side hustles suck?
No, it wasn't. It was the reason. I'm very privileged that I have the benefit of running a creative agency in London. It's a lot of fun, and you only get to do that by being incredibly passionate and driven and focused on what you're doing. And the only way that your business survives in the current climate is by having a highly motivated, highly engaged group of people working for you. The thing that actually motivated me to write the article was actually spending probably several years around the creative industries, and in all honesty, kind of lots of half-cut conversations with people in pubs in East London, with people telling me about how they were going to take over the world with their side hustle and how they were going to make millions out of their organic umbrella business. And 98% of it was bullshit, and it really irritated me because I was actually doing it. I was actually, you know, committed to a dream and to a brand that I believed in and was trying to build that and working very, very hard for it. And I think there was a lot of people that were, and there still are, there will always be, people hiding behind a social media presence, pretending that there's more there than there actually is. I actually, for what it's worth, think a diverse set of interests is a vital thing. I think it's a thing that everybody should have. Everyone that works at Creature is a very well-rounded individual with a very, very broad set of creative reference points and endeavours. Like that's part of our hiring policy, I guess. You know, you want to hire interesting people that like lots of different things. Like we need that. But I think there's a horrible wave of people out there who say they do a lot more than they actually do, and this is where, again, I'm lucky to be sat here with you guys, because you're people that actually do it, you know, and actually there's actually a real thing there. So I think I'm going to pass the mic back in a second, but I think one of the things for me, just to call it out, that I think is probably the thing I hate most, is the term side hustle. I think it's the thing that drives me nuts. It's a kind of bit of bullshit dramatic language for me around a passion, around a thing that people believe in and want to spend their time and effort on. And I think that there's a kind of weird kind of commercial economic underpinning to the word side hustle that I think some people tend to kind of try and leverage to make themselves look cool or make it look like they're more successful than they actually are, when in reality quite often it's people trying really hard to make the world better by being interested in a bunch of different stuff. So yeah, my biggest thing is people saying that they've got a passion for a thing and that they're driving a brand forward, when really it's a load of kind of social media hot air.
I think you might self-destruct when we talk about corporate side hustles later.
Sure.
The internal side hustle. I think that might
Sure.
that might sort of, I'll see you kind of running off into the distance when I ask you about that. But actually, something that you've kind of touched on in terms of the kind of social media aspect of the side hustle, and we've seen kind of Simon Gunning from Calm recently said that social media is this generation's smoking, in terms of like the pressure that puts on people to perform in your day job, but also have this incredible side hustle on the side. And I completely get what you're saying, but when I've spoken to recruiters, particularly at tech brands, they actually talk about that's something that they're actively looking for in young creative talent. So there's almost a pressure to sort of say, to build a side hustle that you don't necessarily have, if that makes sense. I'd love to get your view on that, Lauren.
I'm not sure where to start on a sort of side hustle that doesn't exist, but I can.
A souped-up side hustle.
But I've heard that as well. That one of the people that I interviewed on my podcast as part of my side hustle was Nishma Robb from Google, and she was kind of asking me questions about Powersuit Social afterwards. It's kind of like, okay, so how much time do you spend on that? But it kind of turned into like slightly interview questions, and she was saying, yeah, we really value that at Google, is people that have a thing that they're spending their time on. I guess because they see it as a kind of it's a bit of a calling card as to kind of showing that somebody works hard, but showing that they're driven enough to go and bother to make something rather than just hang out on the sofa. That's not to say anyone that doesn't have a side hustle is spending all their time on the sofa. But sorry, to the point about mental health, I think that's probably true, that there's a risk of it being a bit of a toxic narrative about, if you're not a kind of #girl boss smashing it on Instagram, then you're not like a successful creative human being. So I've spoken on a couple of panels relating to side hustles before, and I realised that I'm speaking alongside other people that have them, and I was like, oh, actually, you don't need to have one to be kind of have a successful creative career. It's just kind of it should be a thing that feeds you rather than makes you feel like you have to do it for the sake of it.
Because I think that time management point is really interesting. In the interest of full transparency and making everyone else feel less like a failure, my side hustle is sleep, because I have young children. So in terms of that sort of time management side of it, because we all know the long hours culture of the creative industries is kind of can be difficult to sort of having a life, let alone having kind of a passion project. Rebecca, I'd love to get your view, especially as a freelance creative, as to how you get that balance, because you create this amazing podcast, such incredible creative work, but then you're also sort of smashing it in your day job as well. I mean, how?
Yeah. I think, there's so many points that I just want to answer. I think there's a kind of misconception. I do agree, I'm not sure I really like the word side hustle. You know, like I'd love to call it a hobby, but no one really would. I don't know, it just sounds a bit old school. How do I do it? What I realise is that no one told me, like I absolutely love my day job. I'm a creative. I love coming up with my ideas, working for brands, absolutely love it. And what no one told me that actually you could do something else outside of work and enjoy that too. So what I do is I'm really strict with myself in terms of boundaries. Like my agency is paying for my time. I'm going to fully dedicate that time to them, and I love it. But I will wake up at 6 in the morning or come home after work and then do my side hustle, hobby, whatever it is. And that's how I think that's really important, that you have those boundaries. And I think there's misconception that if you've got a side hustle, you just hate your job, and that you're doing it because you're really trying to get that off the ground and make millions. First of all, I'm not going to make millions out of podcasts, so I wish. And second, you know, I love my job. I'm very lucky to have it.
But there's definitely a lot of brilliant entrepreneurs that have come out of advertising. And interestingly, for some sections of Adland, it feels like it's almost easier for some, I'm thinking of some women here, to launch their own business that allows them to work on their own terms.
Yeah.
Rather than thrive in an existing agency structure, which is incredible when you think about how difficult and challenging it is to launch your own business. Do you think that there is a worry amongst agencies that, you know, a lot of people doing their side hustle or their passion project or their hobby because they love it, not because it's going to be an alternative business? But do you think, kind of on the flip side of what Google's saying, you know, we want people like that, are there kind of established agencies that are a bit uncomfortable with that balance?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that before, and even when I was at my last sort of permanent job, there were some worries that I wouldn't fully dedicate myself to them. I think that's something that should really push away from. I think they really need to embrace the fact that people have passion project side hustles, because I read a really interesting stat recently that 85% of jobs are not been created yet, like for 2030, which means that we really need to be adaptable, learn new skills. And by having those kind of passion projects, and about accepting that your employees have side hustles, it's a really good way of getting more skills within your business, basically.
Actually, it's kind of repeating Rebecca's point, but I found that there's like a lot of really specific skills that I've learned that have been quite helpful in my day job. So having worked in a sort of a digital agency and now a social agency, but the thing I've been doing in my spare time is kind of building like an audience over email, Instagram, Twitter, doing like paid social ads, and you know, they're just like experimenting. I'm just sort of trying, like, what happens if I put 20 quid here and try out this audience and that sort of thing. And but so I'm doing the job of some of my colleagues, and sometimes asking them for help, or sometimes just kind of experimenting my own. You know, obviously in the evenings, not at work. But I don't know, it's been a really big learning opportunity. Is like quite often. I know we talk a lot about agencies being siloed, but I think it's probably true that if you're like a producer or something, you don't really know what a paid social person's day job is, or like how they do their job, and so it is quite a big opportunity to kind of get those very practical skills.
Ben, what's your take?
I'm trying to remember, what was the question again?
Because I wonder, so in terms of agencies being concerned when staff have a passion project or a side hustle, that they're going to go off and launch that. Because I wonder what the difference is. Because if you have a stake in the agency that you're building and that you created, whether that's an equity stake or you're on the board, that your attitude to that agency is slightly different and you're fulfilled in a slightly different way. Because a lot of people I speak to that have got these passion projects, it's about having some ownership, which is difficult to do, especially if you're in a kind of more junior position in an agency. So I'd love to get your view on that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one for me, because I think there's another way of talking about side hustles, which is dreams, right? And it being a thing that people want to do and they believe in very passionately. And I believe in people chasing those and chasing them hard, because because that's what I've done. That's what I'm doing with my life, and I'm very privileged to be in that position. I think that people having side hustles or other interests in an agency, I think there's lots of different factors for why that happens, and I think that ownership, I actually understand why people do it. Like, it's not it's where my perspective is not saying I don't understand it, it's just saying I find particularly the fake ones difficult to support. I think that the side hustles as a thing that big agencies, I guess, shy away from, or agencies kind of struggle to encourage, I think tends to come from a working culture, I think, in those agencies of poor motivation. Like, I'm saying that from an agent's from the perspective of being a person who runs an agency full of highly motivated, highly driven people that are all working very, very hard to make the best work we possibly can in a very, very competitive environment. I recognise that in bigger agencies, which have poor culture and are spending most of their time trying to protect keeping talent in their business, a side hustle is a terrifying thing, because they're looking at it as a distraction, as a ripcord to potentially leave that business. I share that. People's desire to want to leave that culture. Like, that's why we are building a business that doesn't do that. So I think when people decide that they want to chase a dream outside of their current working environment, I totally understand it. I just find it frustrating on a bunch of levels. I find it difficult to get my head around a little bit, because I've actually never really experienced it, because my previous career was working at a well-known agency around the corner, where we were incredibly well stretched and incredibly diverse in our output, and it was incredibly motivating. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then Creature, and Creature's been exactly the same for me. But I do know that I've sat on panels like this before and had people sat talking about just sat rotting on accounts, in major agencies where they haven't got anything to do, where they're not stimulated, they're not stretched, they're not creating diverse output, and that's a perfect feeding ground for the doubts or for wanting to chase other endeavours. So I do hold kind of the people that run those big agencies responsible for that kind of environment and the culture of those businesses, and the fact that people feel the need to go chasing those dreams outside of the business, because it means they're running agencies that aren't highly motivated, highly driven, with a clear vision for what they're trying to put out there.
I wonder, in line with that, if sometimes, particularly kind of if we're looking at sort of hobbies as a kind of hedge, if you are in that sort of situation, which obviously you guys aren't, but that perhaps your sort of side project allows you to sort of have one step outside of the company you work for, but not necessarily go, this is shit, and leave. So it becomes a bit of a zero-sum game. I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, do you think that sometimes it's just a kind of bit of a sticking plaster to a creative career that's not working out the way that you would want it to?
So often people talk about, it's slightly, again, it's some of the language around this subject is really difficult, because I think so often a side hustle, or should we say a hobby or another endeavour, is built from a frustration about a lack of creative opportunity. So often it's that, but it's not always that. Sometimes it's a passion around the political landscape of the industry that you work in, or sometimes it's around a purchase of personal interest in something. Like, there's nothing wrong with any of that, I don't think. I think that to go back to what I said previously, I think that the toughest thing for me is side hustle as a piece of language just infuriates me, because it's either, for me, it's so weird how much it annoys me. I'm so aware of it, but for me, when you say hobby, I go, that's or wider interest. I totally support it when it's people attempting to be kind of polymaths or serial entrepreneurs while they're in the employment of another agency. I have a real problem with that. So, but I think hobbies and side interests are a really healthy thing.
Rebecca, I'd love to bring you in here, because especially from a freelance perspective, because there is this kind of really interesting broader conversation happening about the future of creative work, the multi-hyphen method, this whole kind of, different ways of working, which is really interesting. I mean, from that perspective, do you feel like you are affording yourself the possibility of creating a creative life for yourself on different terms? I mean, how do you see that evolution?
It's a very good question. I feel like it's very personal to me, though. I wouldn't be able to sort of talk for everyone else. It's true that when I decided to go freelance, it was to do because I wanted to have a bit of time to explore my passion points, side hustle, whatever. But actually, another big reason for me is very much related to that stat that I just given, that I just don't know where this industry is going, and I want to future-proof myself. I've always been about that, which is about knowing what's next. And by sort of exploring what's out there with different agencies, that's what's interests me. And already, like doing a few stints in different places, I have seen briefs change, clients change, like so much in the space of a year, which is incredible. So that's the main reason for me that I went freelance. I do know a lot of people that go freelance because they have their side projects as well. And there's nothing wrong with that, personally. I feel that you can be dedicated to more than one thing. I think as creative people, you need to have that kind of polymath attitude and being able to sort of connect different passion points together to come up with the best ideas.
And Lauren, what's your view on that? Because obviously you perhaps your side hustle, you know, you've changed jobs since we've first met. So that's kind of that's your career constant to some degree. Like, how do you have the balance between the two?
How do I have the balance? Just while I think of it, Richard Robinson from eConsultancy, when he came and spoke on one of my panels last year, and I held it at my last agency, and he said, I don't think you should let your agency have any kind of stamp on it. This needs to be your own thing, that whenever you move jobs, it's your thing and it's your IP. But so it has been my career constant in that sense. It has sometimes been a bit difficult balancing my time, I think partly because I think a mistake I've made is that when things are going well with Powersuit Social and I get interesting people to agree to be on the panels and that sort of thing, I start kind of going, yes, like I'll like say yes to everything, or like now I'm speaking on 3 panels in 5 days at the moment and trying to organise a Christmas party for freelancers, and I'm like, I've overcommitted, this was really stupid, and I've done it again. But I hope that I still am bringing my best self to work and just not seeing my boyfriend. So like he suffers, the job doesn't. But I can admit that something's going to give somewhere. So like I'd say probably last year I didn't see as much of my friends and family as I would have, as maybe they would have found valuable. And so, but I think they kind of saw that I was excited about something, and they have like given me their support, but also kind of like, can you start hanging out with us again, Lauren? But yes. I think there's always going to be an element of compromise, and I think you've probably felt that on the sort of sharp end in the like business sense. So it's kind of keeping an eye on that. For the record, I also hate the term side hustle. I know I count with the panel name, but I think it does get called that, and it made me deeply cringe the first time I read it, the term side hustle, and other people have asked me about my side hustle, and I'm like, it's it's a kind of partly because it feels a bit American, but I don't know.
Ben, I'm going to now push you over the edge because IBM talks about internal side hustles. So, and then you mentioned Google earlier as well. I mean, and in principle, at least, they endeavour to give their employees 20% of their time to do their own projects. So they're kind of baking it in. On the sort of flip side of that, you've got a lot of people working in agencies on side hustles in their own time, effectively for their own companies. You know, so it's a difficult balance. Do you think that, especially with the time pressures in mind, that creative people should have more opportunities to realise their potential within the companies that they work for?
100%. I mean, I think that. I think the time pressures on the creative industries and on creative people is incredibly high, and it's only getting harder and harder. And it's again one of the reasons why I love being part of an independent agency and being part of that group of people fighting the good fight for creativity. It's fucking hard because there's a lot of giant agencies out there that will undervalue and undersell creativity and will bend over and allow a client to kind of ask them for limited creative development time, for example, which leads to horrific long hours culture because people are expected to generate really, really good creative work in limited time. So the only way they can actually make that up tends to be outside of working hours. So we fight really, really hard with all the clients we meet, and I hate talking about it like this because there are really good clients out there, and we've met as many really good ones as we have met bad ones. But as an industry, we need to fight for the value of that creative time and the time it takes to do our jobs properly. And I think that that pressure is indicative of actually probably a business climate of people wanting more for less, which is incredibly frustrating. It's just to say another thing. I think that one of the weird things for me about this whole discussion is that I actually think the creative industry is heading towards more flexible working. I think it's heading towards probably more freelance people working within it. I think that the agencies of the future will be much more fluid in the way that they employ people and work, and we've already seen that and utilise that to a degree. I think that we operate as a bigger agency than our headcount, as it were. I think that is the future, and that is a juggling act that I've certainly had to learn over the last few years. And I think that world actually plays brilliantly into the ambitions of people that have multiple interests. Like, I think that's a really healthy thing. I think that the industry heading that way is a good thing. Practically, as things stand, there's fewer and fewer clients that want long-term relationships. I think there's a lot of kind of economic uncertainty, which is obviously driving that, which means that we're having to learn to kind of run with teams of people that are fluid. It's a funny one. It just means that for me, when we have those people in Creature, they have to be them. I want their focus entirely on what they're doing and doing an excellent job while they're there. But the freelance kind of talent that does come into our business that isn't focused doesn't tend to be there for very long.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that I think me and you are coming up against the same problems, but sort of from a slightly different viewpoint, because my whole reason for starting Powersuit Social was to do with the kind of economic uncertainties or kind of bigger things at play that are meaning clients are tightening their belts or kind of being more unreasonable in terms of their asks. And so that's affecting people I know working in agencies or like freelancers that I know. And so my whole point with it was to have conversations around the sort of commercial viability of creative work, whatever that might be. It doesn't have to be kind of advertising creative. It was kind of have like quite frank conversations about where things are going. So just funny that that's what I'm spending my outside time doing, and sometimes risking it being a distraction. But like I say, I think we're sort of coming up against the same stuff, and it's just playing out a bit differently for us. And sorry, just to sort of jump to Rebecca, I know that you mentioned when we had a coffee the other day that RGA has a kind of setup of it. I think you said it was almost like nearly everybody is freelance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still too new there to really talk with RGA, but yeah, they do have a lot of freelancers, and I agree. I think that is where it's going to move to, having different teams of specialists coming to work on different projects. I see it on my client Nike at the moment, and how they're working is very interesting. Without saying too much, I've just realised. But yeah, so but to answer your question about IBM and Google, I think we all know that, first of all, I don't think it is 20%. I think it's a really good marketing tool. But they're really clever, right? Because they go, do you know what? Don't go outside. It's like when you're a teenager and your parents say, you're not allowed to smoke or whatever, and if they allow you to do it at home, it's like they can control the situation. And I think of them in that way is that that Google is trying to sort of say, do it in-house so we can take your product and, make it viable for us. And I think everyone should steal that model. I mean, let your employees be happy, do their side hustle, or whatever we want to call it, passion point. Like, it could be as simple as you're a fan of film, for example. You do your own script on the side and you really want to do a short film. Do you know what? Tell your boss that, and then they could organize a whole event around film, and you can have clients come in and you can show off this amazing employee that you've got. So I just think that we really have to move away from a kind of black and white world. We should just embrace how we are as people.
That's a really interesting point about the kind of marketing tool in terms of the tech companies, because a lot of the big agency networks are always talking about the war for talent because they love hypermasculine language, but also because they are statistically, if you look at the number of people going from WPP to Google and Facebook, it's a huge proportion of their employee base. And it's really interesting, that idea of actually maybe they're not actually offering that, because it's like holiday, unlimited holiday.
That's right.
People take less holiday, you know.
Yeah.
It's kind of, you know, but I love the idea of permission, like permission to express yourself and be yourself.
Yeah.
Before I turn it over to the audience for questions, could you all sort of give one point, and obviously this doesn't quite apply to your side hustle, which is talking and writing about side hustle sucking, but just from a creature perspective, because in many ways you have ownership of what you're doing in the way that creatives doing side hustles do. Could you sort of share your one piece of advice with the audience as to kind of how you get things off the ground?
Yeah.
So Ben, your advice might be you don't, but I'll ask you last so you can decide and or self-destruct.
Yeah.
So if I could start with you, Rebecca.
Great. I would recommend everyone to start something, anything, just putting it out there. The beauty of this new world that we're living in is that you can learn things so quickly. I can now edit a podcast. I never thought I could do that. I can now sort of not be afraid to ask questions to my heroes in the industry. You know, all these things, it really has enriched my life in so many ways. And it's enriched my creative work as well, because I'm working on a podcast at the moment. So, you know, it's all sort of goes in a virtuous circle. How do you start it? That's a really good piece of it. We talked about this last time, actually. I told everyone I was going to do a podcast, even though I hadn't set up anything. Got the chance to go to the Cannes, and I just emailed people and said, can we have an interview? And I hadn't got the equipment. I didn't have anything. And then fate happens to have different friends gave me the equipment. So just tell other people is quite a good way to sort of make yourself do something.
I actually had the same thing happen with the podcast, which is when I'd already started the events and somebody said, like, what are you planning to do next? And I was like, I'm thinking about doing a podcast. And then they told somebody else, who then asked me like a month later, be like, so-and-so says you're starting a podcast. I was like, oh, yes, I am. And then that gave me the reasons to do it. But sorry, in terms of advice for getting it off the ground, this is just how I personally felt about it, was I waited until the point that I was like so bloody excited about, like, I want to have conversations about the future of creativity, and I was so like bursting to talk to people about it and make it a thing, that I kind of didn't let myself until that point, that I was really excited about it, that so excited that it like kept me, it like really energized me, and it really energized me in my day job as well. It just hadn't had this sudden little like burst. It was so kind of wait till that point that you're like, cannot wait to get it out into the world, and then go and do it.
I think basically if you have a dream, be that a business dream or a career dream that isn't your immediate job, I believe 100% to go and chase it and go and do it tomorrow. I think there's the best way to start it is just to start doing it and bite the bullet and get on with it. There's no perfect time, I don't believe, for starting any kind of new endeavour. I think that like you'll know when it is, but certainly from a business perspective, there's never a good time. It's just the sooner you get on with it, the sooner you start fucking it up and learning what not to do. I think that other interests or hobbies, should we call them, or other kind of passions, I think are a thing that everybody should have, and I think it's a thing that everybody should be striving for, because I think it makes you a richer, more diverse, and more well-rounded human being. So I would never say to people not to have a bunch of different stuff they're interested in. I think that the only challenge I have really to people is people know when they're compromising what they're doing. You know when you're compromising it. You know when your mind is not on the job, and that's the point where really I think you should be committing to your dream, or what have you.
Thank you. Has anybody got any questions? Are there any questions from there's one there. Have you got a...
So I have two questions, if that's okay. So one question is, do you think that a side hustle needs to be something you make money from? And the second question is kind of more of a statement, but also a question. Do you think that side hustles tend to be more of a female thing rather than a male thing because of the inequalities in the workplace at the moment?
Amazing questions. You should have a side hustle as a journalist. You are a journalist.
The money question. On the money point, I don't think it necessarily does have to make money. I know that I spent a lot of my own money trying to get events off the ground, and managing to, but I definitely ended up with a sort of deficit. There's no. I think when I came up with the idea, I was like, oh, you could charge for tickets, and then that would be my pocket money. No. But yeah, I don't think the money should be the end game. And so, while you mentioned it might be a sort of economic need, necessity, I think that a lot of sort of side projects that are out there probably don't really make money, and so you have to want it enough for it to only break even. I see it as kind of putting good stuff and sort of doing things for free, putting that out in the world, and that can lead to sort of paid opportunities later down the line. So like rather than expecting to be making money from, say, events or a podcast or anything like that, if you sort of make enough of a name for yourself through your job and your project, then you start getting paid opportunities come your way. Do you want to try on that?
Yeah, I'll answer your second question, shall I? It's quite hard. I think yes, to some extent. It's true that I wanted to go freelance and wanted to do a side hustle passion point because I wanted to have more control, and a lot of the times I have felt ignored, and that's the truth of it. The number of times I've come up with ideas and ways to promote my agency and just got completely ignored. I would have been more than happy to sort of help them. You know, I always give a lot more to someone else than myself, which is the wrong thing to do. And then I was like, do you know what, I'm just going to start my own thing. But the other thing, and I guess I haven't really talked about, is, you know, my podcast is very much about helping that to change the industry. It's about putting those diverse voices and really finding out how did these women get to that level, because it's hard for me now, but it must have been 10 times harder for when they first started. So yeah, I'm trying to think if I know any guys who've done side hustle. Yeah, I do actually. I do know. I don't think it's sort of, you know how it is. It's not that black and white. I really don't believe in things like that. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Because you had Clemmy Telford on your
That's
podcast recently, and she's a really good example of, she was a creative director at Grey, and she's really launched her own platform, you know, as a really kind of amazing, amazing creative and an amazing mother. And it's interesting that it's easier for her to launch out on her own than work in an established network. But there's so many examples of amazing mums from advertising that have launched their own. Sarah Heiss. Yeah. Sarah Heiss at Mush Mums. Amelia Terode, who set up the Form Break Collective.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I would be investing, if I was an VC, I'd be looking at mums leaving advertising agencies and giving them all my money.
Maybe that should be your side hustle.
That will be my side hustle. Luckily, I don't have any money because I'm a journalist. So has anybody else got any questions? Or there's one just back there. Should I give you this? Here, I'll come.
Hi there. I was just wondering why neither of you ladies seem to have plugged your podcasts, number one. And secondly, just wondering whether you've seen people's side hustles being collaborative or the opposite, highly personal, bearing in mind that there already isn't enough time. So can they possibly be collaborative creatively, or do they tend to be very narrow from what you've seen of colleagues and friends, blah, blah?
Okay, I'll tell you the name of our podcasts. My podcast is called Power Suit Podcast, like a suit, 80s suit. The sort of 80s reference being, I feel like we're in a time of the same sort of flux and like boom and bust as we had in the early 80s. There's sort of parallels going on now. And so I interview a different creative leader each episode about their career and where they see the industry going and their advice for sort of people trying to sort of crack into that industry. And I've already forgotten the second question.
Collaboration.
Oh, collaboration. I think you're right that quite often it is very personal, when I was on a panel with Laura Jordan Bambuck recently, and she said something like, "I love what you guys do with Powersuit Social," and I was thinking, it's just me. There's nobody else. But she was really passionate about doing things as a collaboration, and she said as much. So she started Can't Festival, I think, with Simon Gill, and she started She Says with other people, and hers has very much been kind of taking advantage of, well, in a positive sense, sort of brilliant network of people to make good stuff happen. So there's probably only so much that people like us can do as individuals.
I actually think it's really exciting. I've become much more collaborative. I mean, you were trying to get me on a panel yesterday, and then I was giving you some names. I love it. I've got a real community. We've got a WhatsApp group where we just help each other out. You need to be on that. We need to sort that out. And I did plug it at the beginning, but maybe I'll just say it again for my podcast. It's called This Way Up, and it's all about sort of interviewing women in the creative industry about the good, the bad, and the ugly of their career.
Thank you for the question. I think that's all we've got time for. So thank you so much, and thank you to the great panel.
You.